Welcome to The One Inside, an internal family systems podcast. I'm your host, Tammy Sollenberger. I'm excited that you and all of your parts have taken time to be with me and all of my parts. If you are a coach, a client, a therapist, if you are in business or education, and you're curious about the IFS model, you are in the right place. Now, let's see what happens on today's podcast. Hey everyone! Today I'm talking with Allison Cook, who is the author of Boundaries for Your Soul. The first 4 minutes may feel like you find yourself in the middle of our conversation, and that's exactly what you do. I hit record and we jumped right in. If you don't know about the Enneagram, simply put, this is an ancient personality test using 9 numbers that represent motivation, fears, and desires. It's way more involved than that, so I put a few links in the show notes. There's a link about the Enneagram, and there's a link to a free test if you're interested in finding out about your number. We weave the Enneagram throughout our conversation, so I decided just to keep this first part here. I had such an indecisive part inside of me come up about where to put all this information that it triggered a procrastination part. And of course, that triggered a very angry and annoyed part. So this podcast is actually coming out a few days later than I would like. But I wanted you to know that for some reason, this Enneagram thing really triggered these different parts inside of me. And I actually just noticing, telling you that actually feels pretty good just to speak for that. If the Enneagram is not your jam and you just want to get to all the IFS goodies, you will not be disappointed. Allison is a gifted teacher, and what she shares about boundaries between parts and self is fantastic. I love what she shares about how parts begin to trust self, and she gives such practical tips about how self can emerge. She uses this idea of peeling away parts, and as we peel away parts, self is. It is such an interesting episode because we talk about boundaries, but we also talk about integration. Integrating faith and psychology, integrating IFS and the Enneagram, integration and boundaries, self-emerging. It's beautiful stuff. I hope you enjoy.
For me, the best way to look at the Enneagram is, look, your number is really a part of you that's extremely close. It's not all of who you are, but
Yes.
it's a part of you. And people then are like, oh, it's like that. People who are into the Enneagram get that.
Okay, so I'm going to write that down because I'm super into the Enneagram right now, which you know, and I've been listening to Annie C. Downs.
Yeah.
Yes, and
I've listened to her whole summer series. It's amazing.
Yes, yeah. So good. And so uncomfortable when you listen to your number. It's so uncomfortable.
Oh my gosh, the 3 was amazing.
Yeah,
it was
so
really
annoyed
good.
with the 3s.
Were you really? I thought the guy was so honest. I was like, oh my gosh, he's so honest, but it's so painful.
Yeah. I mean, one of the new things for me. One of the new things with the Enneagram is the idea of 3s don't like feedback, because that is so true for me. Like any type of feedback, unless it's I'm amazing, is so hard for me to hear. Like it's and then I just hyper focus on it.
Yeah, me too. But do you think part of that, I agree with you, I'm the same way, and part of that is I'm giving myself, I'm critiquing, I'm not a huge inner critic like a 1, but I want to look good. I want to put out a good product. So, I mean, the minute after I'm doing something in my mind, I'm like, okay, here's where I could have improved that. And it's not a harsh process, but it's a very rigorous process. So it's almost like I don't need that criticism from others because I'm going to be on it. And then but obviously always we do need feedback from other people too. But it's because it's because I'm continually working to kind of make sure things are better.
Yeah, or like that. I completely agree. Like, I don't have a big critic. I don't feel guilty about stuff. Like, that's not something that is for me. And I think that's part of being a 3. But yeah, I'm so on top of,
You want it to be good.
I want to be good and I want it to be efficient. And I'm like,
you're going to get it done.
I'm going to get it done. Yeah. And so, yeah.
It's coming from a different place for the threes. It's not a harsh inner critic. It's the desire, like the fact that I don't want criticism is like, it's just going to put more like, and also I kind of know what I want and where I want to go. And so, but then you're getting into this sort of, for lack of a better word, you can cut this, but like the almost narcissistic aspects of being three, where there's that ultra confidence that.
Yeah. And I want to cut that you just said that, but I probably won't, because there's some truth in that it's like, I feel really strongly about the path I want to go down and what I want to do. Yeah. And sometimes, even though I'm I'm a pretty good people person, but sometimes I can get really narrowly focused and be like, here's my task and move out of my way. And I mean, that happened even this morning. I got up early and I wanted to publish a podcast before we started. And my husband was still here and leaving for work, and he wanted to talk and connect. And I tried to do that, but I wanted to be like, the three of me was like, you have 5 minutes. I will connect with you in 5 minutes, and then you have to go. And then.
Oh, I feel you. I know. I will be sitting there and internally I'll be like, eye contact, listen, focus, because inside everything in me wants to just go back to what I was doing.
Yeah. My project is very important. Let me stop for a second and why don't we introduce you to everyone? Tell me a little bit about who you are and tell us about who you are.
Sure. Yeah. So my name's Allison. I'm a counselor in the Boston area, and my degree, I have a joint degree actually in religion and psychology. So my background is sort of in the integration of psychology with spirituality, with faith. And so I work a lot in that space, and I'm also a writer. I wrote a recent book with Kim Miller on Boundaries for Your Soul, which is a Christian adaptation of the internal family systems model. So I do a lot in boundaries, both internally with the various parts of ourselves, but also interpersonally with other people.
That's great.
Yeah.
How did you come about finding IFS?
I was almost finished. I was working on my dissertation, almost finished with my doctoral work, and I met Kim. And Kim knew about it. She introduced me to it, actually, my co-author, she started talking to me about it, and immediately it was just, I was like, this is it. This is what I've been looking for. Because I'd been all throughout my schooling, I was like, how do you integrate psychology with spirituality, right? How do you integrate the fact that we're deeply spiritual and there's a spiritual healing that can occur, but that we have to deal with our thoughts. We have to deal with our feelings. We have to deal with our behaviors. We have to deal with our backgrounds, our life stories. How do you bring these two things together? And she started kind of just talking about this idea of parts and the self. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is exactly what, and I wasn't introduced to it in school. So, and I was like, this is what I've been like sort of trying to put together in my own mind. And here it is. And so then from there, I just that was maybe 12 years ago. And then I just kind of took off with it.
Wow.
Yeah.
And I've heard of so many people say that before, where they heard about it and then it just felt like, this is what I've always been feeling. And I just never had words or never had a system to make sense of it.
Exactly. And also just my own journey of experiencing what it's like to be multifaceted, which is such a key part of IFS. Feeling like I grew up in a really small rural town in Wyoming, but my whole adult life I've lived in major cities. I have a faith background, but I also have parts of me that are very mavericky and very out of the box, and they're all true. And so, gosh, to put language, various parts of me that the world might see as conflicting, but to me they work together. And it's all of what makes me who I am, was just so freeing.
Yeah, I feel like as a Christian, sometimes it's like it's supposed to look a certain way. And then when it doesn't, then sometimes I think people, either go one way or the other. Like, it's like, and I think this happens to kids in their 20s. I'm hearing this all the time in my practice of like, I'll see teenagers that are from Christian families and they grew up Christian, but they feel like it has to be one path or the other path.
Yes.
And it's sort of like, I have to be all this or all this. And, they often don't choose the Christian path. And, so I think that makes sense, thinking of parts, that there are parts of me that hold this faith, or even, I don't know, if self holds that faith. And even as if I do these mavericky things or have these mavericky beliefs, or I don't know, that doesn't have to be all or nothing, maybe.
Well, and really, when you look at the life of Jesus, which is the center stone of the Christian faith, there's a lot of competing things going on there. He's bringing healing, he's bringing peace. He's also can be really harsh. He demonstrates a full range of emotions, and he does it in perfect wholeness. So you realize that, we're all, we're not this unilateral thing. As we are created in the image of a very complex God, there are many facets to us, and they can all kind of exist in harmony. And I love what you said. Like, folks are like, oh, I have to choose, quote unquote, I put in air quotes, the Christian path. Well, it doesn't mean they're not choosing a Christian path. They're not choosing a path that has been prescribed as the Christian path, right? So there's so many. And again, I don't mean to sound too obviously at a certain point you might, reject core tenets of what it means to be whatever faith background you are. But within sort of core tenets, there's a lot of ways to live out your faith in harmony with who God made you to be.
Let's talk a little bit about, I guess I want to hear more about what that means with parts.
Yeah, so in the work that I do, because I work with a lot of people coming from a church background, how I would phrase it is there are parts of people that really, really love God and want God to be close and need God. And sometimes those are vulnerable parts. They're exiled parts that almost need a savior or a rescuer in a way that is other parts of them, manager parts, think is naive or are like, it's up to me. I have to do the work, right?
Yes.
And I sit there with those two and I'm like, again, it's never the duality. It's the both and. It's the both. And to me, IFS really gets at that both. And yes, there are parts of you that are so young and so fragile and so vulnerable, and they do need that sense of, it's so reassuring, that sense that there is a God who loves you and who's with you and who will be. And it's also true. And I think of those older parts that have maybe experienced a world where, yeah, God doesn't rescue me from everything. And to kind of help those parts realize, yes, that doesn't mean that God doesn't love you. It means that this part of you is actually kind of figuring out what it means to be a functioning, individuated adult that has responsibility and that needs to work out, your own talents, your own healing. And both of those parts can sort of relate to God in a slightly different way. Yeah. I'll tell people, go look at the Psalms and you can read one of those Psalms on behalf of a part, right? Because there are those vulnerable parts that just need to cry out to God. And then there's the bolder parts that are like, God, like, you're not really helping me right now. I got to do this myself, and each of those parts has a little bit of their own relationship with God. And then what the self comes in and I think creates a space for each of those parts to be where they are. The self is sort of, in my way of viewing self, it's sort of God in you. It's how God lives inside of you, God incarnate, God with us, the Holy Spirit. And so there's space for those differing relationships internally with each of those parts.
I love that. And I love that idea of self. So I have two thoughts, and you can pick which one you want to go to. I want to talk about the self, because I think that sometimes there's this self is that idea that we're all good, And I think sometimes in Christian circles, it's like, we're sinners. And so I'm curious what your thoughts are around that. Cause I think there's lots of different thoughts about what the self is. And
yeah, I love the question, because I think one of the unfortunate, and I think it's bad theology, and I don't think it's comes from some of our oldest and most beloved theologians. You don't see this. It's more of a modern idea that self is bad. Self is bad, God is good. And the truth is, self, if you want to talk in Christian terms, you were created in the image of God. Every human being bears that imprint of a beautiful soul. And parts come in. I mean, literally from the moment we're born, those parts come in and they get wounded and they go, they get messed up. And so that core beautiful soul, the inherent imago Dei, gets covered up, almost immediately with parts, whatever you want to call it, sin or whatever. But it doesn't mean that essence isn't there. And I always look at our work as kind of peeling back those layers of parts that have gotten wounded, that have gone astray, that have, whatever, picked up burdens, that have led them astray, or led them into, maybe unhealthy behaviors or whatever, kind of peeling back those layers to uncover more of that core self. And so, it's so true. Even using the word self, that's bad. But no, I think that's the work of God. That's holy work, is to uncover that essence of pure self that is so good and made so beautifully in God's image.
I'm just smiling right now because that was just like such a perfect answer.
Yeah, self and God, I think the goal is for both. The wholeness is to have a whole self relating to a whole God. And it's not to sort of this dogmatic self-denial. I think that's a real misinterpretation of scriptural passages.
My brother-in-law is a great guy, and he was actually asking me questions about IFS, and with interest and curiosity, which I really appreciated. And he was asking about the self and thinking of self as like, well, self-centered and selfish and self-involved. And so, I mean, that's what we think of when we think of, in our culture and our time and being Americans and all that stuff. That's what we think of as self. And IFS, it's this term we're using, but I almost wish it was called something else.
Yeah, because the term has gotten, and really what those words, self, the qualities of the self, calm, curiosity, compassion, care, they really align with what the Bible talks about, the fruit of the Spirit: kindness, goodness, gentleness, self-control, humility, all these things. And what you're describing would be parts, actually. That's self-gone. That's where parts cover up the self in the way that God intended, when parts of us get selfish, when parts of us become self-centered, when parts of us become narcissistic. Unfortunately, that's what I'm talking about with that covering up. And so we're kind of recovering and reclaiming that word in IFS. In our book, we call it the spirit-led self, to get at this idea of the self in partnership with God. And so when you come from a faith background, that there is that emphasis on the relationship. We're at our best when we're in partnership with God. But either way, those words have definitely kind of maligned the idea of self at its best.
And that was a great example of like, okay, so there's a part of me. So people are sort of new to IFS and they might be like, what are you guys talking about? So there's a part of me that is selfish. This is true. I'm an Enneagram 3.
Right. There you go.
So there's a lot of selfishness in me. But when I put an IFS lens on that, it's like, okay, there's a part of me that is selfish. There are other parts that feel towards that, are angry at that part, or ashamed or embarrassed.
Yep.
And if I peel even those layers back, I think that's part of the peeling back, is the idea of feel towards.
Yes.
I was thinking about that earlier when you were talking. I thought, okay, that's one of the ways we peel back
Yes.
and really get to know a part, is by the feel towards question.
Yes.
So if I'm curious about the part of me that's really selfish,
yes,
and I peel back the parts that are ashamed of that part, then I can really look at that part and think, okay, in self, if self is then looking at that part, I can then see it as a part that's tried to help me.
Yeah.
And it has a good function and it has a good intention.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Absolutely. That you're exactly right. And I mean, that's where you get into this idea of boundaries with parts, because a selfish part, you need to get to know its history. It may experience, other parts of you may experience that part as selfish when really that's a part that maybe never got a chance to pursue a goal. And so now that you're giving it a chance, it's like that part wants to take you over and just completely shut down all the parts of you that maybe want to help people or maybe want to think about others first. And so that's where you kind of, as you get to know that part and you gain trust, and the other parts of you begin to realize, oh, we don't have to let that part take over. We can let that part exist within healthy boundaries because it has good intentions. And so this is where I love the idea of applying boundaries to these parts of us. They each need a space within us. We don't want them to take us over, but we also don't want to push them away. We want them to have occupy a healthy space within us. Just as, we don't want to be overtaken by another person, completely dominated. We need to have a healthy boundary around each relationship. It's the same with these relationships with these parts of us, especially the parts of us that we've experienced as negative.
So that would be like, we sometimes use this term at like parts driving the bus.
Yeah.
Parts driving the bus or part hijacks us. I think that's what you mean by a boundary, is that like, say I have a selfish part, even as I was talking about this morning, sort of a selfish part that was very focused on a goal that I had this morning. And then my husband was wanting a little bit of just connection, that my selfish part kind of hijacked me and was like, nope, we are doing this project. And so that would be that part not having a boundary, or my system not having a boundary.
Yeah.
Is that how you would say that? Or
yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah, you were in that moment. If you're it's possible another part came in and just, but ideally when you're self-led, you're able to say, I'm going to set a boundary with this ambitious part of me right now, or this task-focused part of me right now, because another part of me really values this time making my husband feel heard and honored in this time. And so you're negotiating, and the more you do the work of IFS, the more intuitive that becomes. At the beginning, it's sort of like, you have to take a step back and really pay attention. But, with this idea of boundaries, and I love how you brought in the Enneagram. I have a client who's an Enneagram 4. And so she has a part of her that will go really to these dark places. And it's a really beautiful part of her, and it can also really get dark fast. And so we talked about it as a part of her, and that there are times when that part of her needs a gentle boundary. And that language was, for her, was just like, oh, yes, because these other parts of her are like, just don't go there, just don't go there, just don't go there. But that part of her is real. It needs a space, but it doesn't need to go all the way to the deep, dark hole that's going to lead to depression and some of the things she's battled with. And so she's learned how to kind of acknowledge it, but just put a gentle boundary on it. And it's just a really helpful that when you're able to realize you can do that, it's so freeing. You're honoring yourself, and you're able to use a sort of psychology word, regulate yourself. You're able to manage your emotions in a way that's healthy for everybody involved.
That sounds so good, because it's like the boundary is also kind of like isolating the part, or like that unblending from the part and being like, okay, here's the part. And I'm not necessarily then feeling what these other parts, the experience of that part from the other parts. Like,
exactly.
Did that make sense? Okay.
Yes. And they're always there when you're blended with a part, all you feel is this, but just with that little peeling analogy. And it's exactly as you said, the how do you feel toward, immediately you're going to hear, oh, I hate it, I don't want to be this way, right? Which is another part. So it's so immediate that those parts are right there, but paying attention to them, again, right there, just creates a little bit of that healthy distance. I mean, boundaries are really about healthy distance. They're about not being too close, not being too far. And so you're at a healthy distance, many parts of you can kind of all come out in front of you. I had a trainer who would talk about a safe conversational distance. And I love that because it's like your parts there where you're still connected to it at a conversational distance, but it's not overtaking you, just as you don't want a person, in your face when you're having a conversation.
Yeah. I heard it this way. I like thinking of it this way. Like if I'm holding a pillow really, really close to me, then I can't see it.
Yes.
So if I hold something, or I mean, it could be anything, but I have the pillows in my office, so I often like explain it like, so then I actually, if I have some distance, which is a boundary, if I have some distance from the pillow, then I can actually see the pillow.
Get better. Yeah.
Yeah. So that makes sense. That like, okay, so then if there's inside of me, there's that boundary, and we ask that feel towards question to, as one example of how to then get some boundaries or some space or some softening with the different parts.
Yes.
Does that sound right?
Yes.
Do you have other ways of asking for boundaries or establishing boundaries within parts?
Well, once so there's the first step, which you're getting at, which is the feel toward, where you're actually identifying sort of a particular part to work with and getting it at a healthy distance where you can, and some people don't like the word distance because that feels, I always try to find the language that works with different people. But, when you get that where you're differentiated from it enough to where you can connect to it from the self, that's when a lot of times for me, the boundaries come in when you're working with how these parts can get along with other parts. How can we, it's kind of, and again, the metaphor of parenting children, it's like, if you've got 3 kids, you got to figure out, you can't give all of yourself to all of your kids at all the time. You have to figure out how to make sure each child has your attention, but then you're going to say, I need you to wait a second. I need you to you feel okay. Are you content? Because I'm going to go now spend time with, this person over here. And so you're kind of creating these boundaries that within them, there's a lot of health.
Yes.
And that's where I find it the most, is really in the integration piece, where you're trying to help these different parts of you. And like, to use your example, like if you have that part that feels, another part thinks is selfish. And like with this client who the other parts were just hated this existential part, they called it. But once they understood that we were going to put boundaries around it, then they felt freer, to exist within their boundaries.
That's interesting. It's not just the darkness part, and then the other parts want that part to have boundaries. So that part has boundaries, but then these part have boundaries too, and they actually feel better.
Yeah, I mean, and the best way, that the Enneagram for me is the easiest way to explain this for people who are familiar with it. So for me, if I have a 3 with a 2 wing that get very polarized, because the 2 part of me thinks, and it's very strong, thinks that the 3 part is selfish. And the 2 part of me always wants me to help people. But then I also have, a little bit of a connection to a 5 part of me that kind of observes. And I have a connection to a 1 part of me that really wants to do the right thing. And so at any given moment, each of those, I might need to pull in a little closer or negotiate with to step back, but they each exist within their own healthy boundary where they know they're cared for. I'm connected to them. I value them. They're each so important to me, each of the things that they stand for. And so, yes, it's not that they're vying to take over or to get another part away. They get that my job is to kind of connect to each of them and help them each be exactly what they need to be within those healthy parameters.
I think that demonstrates the difference between part-to-part relationships and part-to-self relationships.
Yeah.
Because my 9, so I'm a 3, and I go to 9 and 6. So I think I go to 9 and health and 6. I'm not sure which one it is. Do you know?
6 in health and 9 in stress.
Okay. Yeah. So in stress, I isolate and stay in bed and
Yes.
don't want to
Avoid.
talk to anybody. Avoid. Yes.
Yes.
That if I'm noticing that there's a part of me that wants to avoid, then I have three parts of me that don't like that avoiding. Like, we've got to get stuff done, we've got a huge agenda, we've got a huge list. And so then my three and my avoidant part, not in 9, are going to go at it, or I'm going to feel a lot of shame for avoiding. But in self, I can honestly be like, I've worked really hard because I'm a 3, so I've done a zillion things. So it's okay to rest. And that avoidance then sometimes looks like rest.
Yes. Yes. And when you've built that trusting relationship self to part, that 9 part of you, it trusts you that, and so then it stays within its healthy boundaries instead of coming out and kind of hijacking you and having you binge watch it, TV for 3 days. It trusts you that, you know what, I trust that self is going to honor and validate the need to rest when the time is. And so yeah, as these parts learn to trust you, learn to trust the self, really, you at your core, the self, they will kind of just exist peacefully within you. It's amazing.
So I have 2 questions around that. I'm going to say both of the questions and then we can figure out how we want to talk about them. But one is, how do you get parts to trust you? I know that's a big question, but how do you like to do that? And then the other question is about the Enneagram. And if you think that, like, is 3 just a part of me, or is 3 related to myself? I'm curious about that, about how the Enneagram and IFS work together. So those are 2 really different questions, but those are 2 that are really up for me right now.
Yeah. Well, so to the Enneagram question, I can tell you what I think. I think most Enneagram masters, which I am not I've studied it, I know it, I use it, but I'm not a teacher in it as Enneagram masters are, would agree that it is a part of you in the sense, even if they don't know IFS, it's, and that you have relationships to other numbers, which is the wings and the arrows and the, and the triads and, whatever. Like, ultimately, we're becoming whole is having a healthy relationship with each number. But the core number, I would say, is a part of you that is probably one of your closest protectors, typically.
Okay.
It's just a part. And that's where, like in our book, where we'll talk about, the most common managers, you can almost map those on to Enneagram types, right? The perfecter, the pleaser, the task manager, the controller, the worrier, the avoider, in those protective categories, some of the most common managers and firefighters that we come across map very quickly onto those 9 Enneagram numbers. It's fascinating, right?
That is fascinating.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
Yeah, you can kind of just go through the list. And then what IFS brings to the table is, it says, okay, so it almost makes it easier when you know your Enneagram number. Okay, this is probably going to be a part of me I'm really going to have to do some work with.
Right, because there is this idea that I can be a healthy 3 or an unhealthy 3. And I think of me in my 20s, I was a very unhealthy 3. And now I've done a ton of work because I've done some IFS, and I've done a lot of IFS, and I'm a lot older than that now. And I think of, like, me now versus me in my 20s, and I can see a complete difference in, like, being a healthy 3 and an unhealthy 3.
And what I think IFS brings to the table is, when you're quote unquote being in an unhealthy space, there's likely an exile that's not being cared for. Yeah. And likely that core wound is along the lines of, kind of, we know with the 3, a lot of times it's about not being seen or not being visible or not being heard, not having a voice, and so it's finding that exile, right? And working to heal it so that 3 part of you is no longer overcompensating for the exile, but it's just becomes a part of you that is functioning as it should, as it in terms of really helping you get things done and being successful. But that can happen because that exile is now connected to self and is getting the healing that it needs. You're no longer doing it for those reasons. I think they map together beautifully. But really, even if you look, so the ones when that reforming, perfecting part is so close, as you know, you can immediately go, gosh, there's an exile under there of shame, of feeling not good enough, not approved, not perfect enough, right?
Yes.
And that's what needs to be healed.
Yes.
So that one can then move into their healthy area, which is holding things a little more loosely, you know, which is when ones are healthy, they look a little more like a 7. They access that lightheartedness. So you know, I mean, and you can really go again down the list that there's an exile hiding underneath each of those strong, when those numbers are in unhealth.
That's beautiful. And so for people that don't know, what is an exile, for people that are not super familiar with IFS?
Yeah, so in IFS, exiles are the vulnerable parts of us, right? So there's the 3 categories of parts. The managers and the firefighters are both protectors, and they're the parts of us that, the managers are the parts of us that are front and center, that we want the world to see. They please, they produce, they perform. Those are the ones that map so well onto the Enneagram. And then the firefighters are our escape artists. They're the parts of us that want to shut down the pain. And a lot of people, I think, in our world just vacillate between the two. It's pouring out, whether you're pleasing, producing, you know, whatever you do managerially, and then shutting down, you know, whether it's social media or entertainment or eating or food or drugs or whatever. We live in those 2 categories, and that third category are those exiles, and they're named exiles because we push them aside, and they're the uncomfortable feelings, they're the pain, the insecurity, the self-doubt, the fear, the feeling invisible, you know, those loneliness, the parts of us that everybody feels on some level, but we don't know what, we push them aside. They're the parts that actually need us the most. They're the parts that need self, and they need God. You know, they need us to peel back those managers and firefighters to give them the attention and the healing and the nurturing they need. And so that's when you get into proper balance. When you get healthy balance is when all 3 of those parts of you need all 3. You were alluding to this. We work hard. We need to unwind, and we also need to care and acknowledge and address and extend compassion toward these really vulnerable feelings that are hiding sort of behind it all. And when you're able to connect in a loving way with each of these parts, you begin to feel more whole. You become more whole. So that's where the exiles fit in.
One of the things that I find interesting about the exile manager firefighter is that often, you know, I have exiles that, like I was talking about this on one of the previous podcasts, I have an exile that doesn't feel like she belongs. And I realized that because I was, everywhere I go, I kind of like put my bag, like I make a little corner for myself, and it will be away from everyone else's stuff. And I put like my bag and my stuff, and I put my drink, and I feel like this anxious energy around, this is where my stuff goes. And I don't want people moving it or touching it. And here's my little, I mean, it could be a tiny spot. Yeah. And someone said, yeah, because you don't feel like you belong. You need to find a place to belong. And I was like, that is so interesting. I never thought about that. I guess I'm saying that it's like, that was sort of the first, like that was the trailhead. Yes. That was like, okay, there's some part there. There's a manager part that is making sure that I have a space, I have a place. Yes. Yeah. And then, okay, that manager, thinking of it almost like a triangle, that manager then is pointing towards an exile, younger part of me, yes, who doesn't feel like she has a place. Yeah. And then in my history, like pinpointing to an actual time in my life, and I can actually think of themes and memories of times that I didn't have a place, or I felt like I didn't have a place, or
Yes.
she felt like she didn't have a place and she didn't feel like she belonged. And then their firefighter around that could be like, when I feel like I don't belong, I will isolate or I will eat. Those are my favorite firefighter behaviors. They probably go with the Enneagram too.
Yeah, that it makes perfect sense. Yeah, you work hard and then your 9 pops in and shuts you out.
Yeah, and then for me, my 9 is sort of going to look a different way. And like a firefighter or in unhealth, a 9, my firefighter is going to look like avoidance, isolating, or eating. Like those are my firefighter behaviors. And so then often the idea of the firefighter and the manager are both working really hard to protect me from feelings of not belonging, which is what that exile feels. So the more intense the exile feels like she doesn't belong, the more intense my firefighter and my manager are going to work.
Exactly. Yeah, you said it right.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you can use an example, another vivid example of that triangle that you're describing, right? Is think about the 8s on the Enneagram, where they're going to control, dominate, that's their manager activity and underneath that is an exile of terror of being exposed, right? There's just a terror of vulnerability, of weakness. And when their managerial activity starts to fail, they're going to lash out, right? Anger is going to be their firefight. Angry can be a firefighter. Lashing out can be a form. I always say to people is a form of a firefighter because it releases emotion in a really it's a way to sort of kind of almost numb what's really going on by just yelling. It's what Freud talked about, kicking the dog, right? You come home from work, you've had a bad day, and then you kick your dog, as opposed to actually feeling what you feel about what went on at work, right? Yes. So anyway, that can, you're doing a really good job of talking about how in all of these things, we typically have a go-to. You can, and there's, people always say, well, how many parts do we have? There's endless, but to try to help people, again, have some boundaries around this, you typically know kind of your go-to managers, your go-to ways of checking yourself out, your really prominent exiles. And again, they can manifest in different ways and shapes and forms, but usually, like you did such a good job of describing that, there's a narrative of, and in your case, of not having a place, not belonging. And I can listen to that and almost get tears in my eyes, right? Because we relate to these tender places that are so vivid, even though they're no longer operative in our adult world.
Exactly. And I think that goes back to that feeling towards, because I think that if I then have a part of me that gets angry that I feel that way, like, what do you mean you don't feel like you belong? And starts telling me in my current life all the ways I belong and how I'm being just such a ridiculous 3, then I'm not able to connect to that exile. I'm not able to really bring compassion to that part of me, because I have other parts that are like, that's stupid and ridiculous. What are you even talking about?
And those parts are protecting you. Essentially, they think they're protecting that exile, but really they're keeping you from that. Those protective parts of us think they're helping us not feel that pain, when really what we need to do is feel the pain a little bit. And again, that's where the concept of boundaries come in, because people don't want to feel that. And we don't want them to be overwhelmed by the pain. If folks who have deep wounds or traumas or have shoved pain so far down, we don't want it to all come gushing out like a geyser, right? We want to feel it a little bit so that we can begin to tolerate it, and so that we can begin to and again, this is to your first question. You asked, how do we build trust, right? We build trust by saying, you know what, I need to feel the sadness a little bit. And I'll talk to people about scheduling their sadness, especially when the grief is deep. Like, we're going to schedule it during this session. We're going to go there a little bit to the sadness, and then you're going to schedule some time this weekend to journal about it. And that's going to be your boundary with sadness, because the other parts are so invested in, I don't want to become sad, right? Those protectors are like, if you go there, you're going to become a sad person.
Yes.
And so we're trying to build trust with the protectors to say, that's your fear. We honor that. We acknowledge that. We don't want that either. But you're building that trust to go, but if we bring out the sadness a little bit and we put some boundaries around it and we put some time parameters around it, the sad part is going to also start to trust us and not overwhelm. So it's all about building trust with these different parts and these different emotions that they carry. And a lot of that is around assuring each part that we're going to put boundaries on each of these parts. We're not going to let them overwhelm.
And that's why we have to go to that protector first that doesn't like that part that's going to be sad, that says, no way. It's almost like that's the gatekeeper. And if that protector says, nope, you're going to be flooded and you're going to become a sad person, or you're going to, I'm an ugly crier. So it's like, no, nope, like you're going to be an ugly crier and everyone's going to look at you and it's embarrassing. And that protector is very strong and very powerful, and it is trying to protect me. So it's like, if I don't have boundaries around that, if I don't go towards that one and help that one trust me, then, and it doesn't, and that's interesting. Okay, I just thought about it. It doesn't have to trust the sad part. It has to trust me. Because if I ask it to trust the sad part, that's not going to work.
No.
It has to trust me. Okay.
That's right. It has to trust you that you don't want. Self isn't fundamentally sad.
Right.
Self has a part. You have a part that is sad, right? And so it needs to trust you that you get that, and you'll help the part of you that's sad get that. So you're the mediator.
Yes. I think that's one of the things that IFS does that is like the aha moment. Like one of the big aha moments in IFS is that right there is that idea of self. As you were talking, I was like, oh, right. Because then if that protector trusts me, then it can relax. And how often I feel like you're saying, those parts don't have boundaries. And so they're all just reacting to each other.
It's like a bunch of kids that have just gone haywire with no boundaries, as opposed to each one kind of contentedly doing their job.
I know in IFS, there is not the idea that we strengthen self. We don't, there's sort of a little bit of a resource self, or.
Yeah, self is, it is, it's not. And that to me, this is where we're getting at. There's sort of the practical and there's the academic sort of technical, and it's very abstract. Self is, and usually when you're working with people, it's you got to be more practical.
Yeah. So I guess thank you for saying that. Sometimes it's sort of like I have this idea and then the words just don't come out. So thank you for saying that's perfect. So, right. So there is this idea that self just is. And then you said the idea of we peel away the parts and then self emerges.
Yeah.
So what I guess I'm curious about is the practical stuff that you do or that you've seen in other people that help self emerge. So with that, so just for an example, I know, and if you follow me on Instagram, then you know that I love paddleboarding. And I know that I'll be on my paddleboard and sometimes I'm out there for an hour listening to parts, chatter, 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 chatter. And it might take an hour or so before I can really just be and feel that self and feel calm and clear-minded. But it's like on the paddleboard, in the water, water always does it for me, wherever that is. But I know that there's some things that I can do. Paddleboarding, hiking, being on the beach, being in the woods. But these are my go-to firefighters. These are my go-to. I know that there'll be a stronger self-connection if I do these things.
Yeah.
Or that parts will relax a little bit. And I'm not sure how to say that. the right way. Yeah. So I guess I was just curious because I think sometimes people want to know that, right? Their minds are busy and parts are really active. And it's like, how do I feel more self? Or how do I even have a chance to get parts to sort of separate out a little bit?
I love that. It's such a practical question because it's not it doesn't have to be some mystical. I mean, it's the same as experiencing God, right? Like people think it has to be some mystical thing. And sometimes it's just, oh my gosh, this is beautiful. You know, God made this, you know, and it's that simple. And it's the same again with my whole theme of, you know, we want to be a whole self who relates to a whole God, right? So I love what you're describing with nature. I think nature is a good one. I will say to people, I will keep it even simpler. I will say, especially if you don't have time, like throughout the day, take a few seconds and just find, like for me, honestly, doing the dishes at the end of the day, I'll be doing the dishes and it's become sort of for some reason I've associated now just to take a deep breath and kind of become aware and notice, oh gosh, all that pleasing that I was just doing. Oh my gosh, all that task. I was just so task. I wasn't even present. There they are. It's right there. It's okay. And I can kind of almost feel the energy of those parts of me, but I'm no longer, as you said, you know, they're relaxed. They're no longer overtaking me. Oh, and then there's that. And then all of a sudden I'll feel that tenderness of, oh, you know, I'm terrible. Oh gosh, there it is. It's okay. No, I'm not terrible. And there's almost a prayer in that. And it can literally take 3 minutes. But I'm just kind of doing the dishes and kind of being with myself and just knowing it's okay. And it's just who I am in that moment. And then and again, breath is a part of it, just kind of acknowledging awareness. And then I might even say, oh God, you're here too, you know, with all these parts of me. And then I just slow down. I'll slow down my body a little bit. Because, you know, again, as a 3, you know, we're just going to go. And it's like, for me, basically, literally just releasing tension, slowing down. I'll experience a little bit of that calm, a little bit of that compassion, and a little bit of that lightness. And that's, you know, sometimes it's that simple. Now, I've done a lot of work with my parts, so they trust me.
Yeah.
You know, but I always want to say to people, it doesn't have to be this magical, you know, the more, you know, you can kind of just simply by relaxing your body, taking a deep breath, maybe just taking a moment to write down what you're noticing you feel inside. And just not trying to fix it, not trying to change it, just say, oh, isn't that interesting? Yeah. Just a moment of curiosity a day can just bring a little bit of that lightness of self that just feels better.
That is great. Thank you for sharing that. And I love practical stuff. You're doing the dishes anyways, so you're going to be sitting there for 5-10 minutes. So might as well just have this experience and checking in with yourself and your body and, you know, checking with parts and saying hi.
What's funny, Tammy, as I'm realizing based on our conversation is I didn't even realize this, but I've negotiated with my 3 part because for me doing the dishes makes that 3 part happy because I'm doing something. So for me, sometimes, and this is where people are different. For me, if I were like, I have to sit for an hour of silence, you know, that part of me would be like, I can't do that. But it's like, okay, that's okay. It's almost like having a little coping tactic for, you know, the little 3 part of me has a little task that's very mindless. So it's finding, you know, for you, I hear when you're saying, you know, paddleboarding, you know, moving my body almost frees up. It gives a part of me something to do so that the other parts of me can relax and I can kind of rise above myself. So it's different for different people. And I always want to say, that's okay. You know, it doesn't have to look the same way for everybody.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's important to know your Enneagram number. Like I feel like it's been life-changing, really. I mean, IFS has been life-changing for me. And I think that learning my Enneagram number has been life-changing for me.
Yes.
Learning my husband's. So
yes.
Oh, okay. He's not just being a jerk. he's a 5. And so this is the reason why these things are happening. And wow, it's really helped parts of me. So that's parts of me really softened towards him.
Yes.
And then I think it's also helped, me not be like, well, I'm perfect. The 3 in me is like, well, it's all you. It's not me. So one last question, if that sounds okay.
Yeah.
If you were not a therapist, what would you be doing?
Well, I'll tell you the first thing that came to my mind, although parts of me have funny feelings about this. I'd be an actress.
Really?
Yeah. I actually left my program for 3 years to study acting, and I loved it, and I love it. And I'm not that great at it, but what I loved about it for me is it gave those, and this was before I knew IFS, is there were parts of me that are performers, and there are parts of me that want to be seen. And it was like therapy for me. And I loved it. I still love it. It's sort of a way, and I don't do much of it anymore because it's so time consuming, but I do think that there's a way in which acting, writing, anything creative is an outlet for parts of us that, just kind of get a chance to be in a little bit of a different way.
I love that's such a good idea. I love that.
Yeah.
Well, and how interesting, thinking of the Enneagram, that really fits with the Enneagram number.
Right. I know. It was the only way I could give myself permission. It felt okay to perform in that capacity. But then you can hear the little 2 part of me that's like, but that's not, it's so funny. So that's my pie in the sky answer, that my parts would just love that. The pragmatic parts of me are like, I'd probably be a teacher.
Oh, okay.
Which I also enjoy.
Yeah.
Very much. Yeah. But it's a little more of the pragmatic.
Right. It's so funny that you're saying that, because I'm like, my answer, which I don't think I've ever shared, but in my head, my answer is that I would sell beach umbrellas and books at the beach.
That's amazing.
Like, I don't really know that I guess it is a job, but.
That's amazing.
I don't know. But I want to have books too, not just the umbrellas.
Yes, that seems very important.
It's important to me. I love books. I love reading. I love talking about books.
And you love the beach.
And I love the beach. So, yeah.
That's amazing. I'm picturing it now. I can see it for you.
Thanks. Well, this was fantastic. If people want to get in touch with you, what's the best way to get in touch with you and to buy your book?
Yeah, sure. I am on Instagram. It's Allison Cook PhD. On Facebook, I have a website, which is AllisonCookPhD.com. I send out a weekly newsletter with thoughts on boundaries and all things that we've been talking about. So I'd love for folks to find me there.
Great. And sign up for your newsletter, and then get on wherever they buy books and buy your book.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you so much, Allison.
Thanks for hanging out today. If you like this episode, make sure you subscribe. And if you really like this episode, share it with a friend and leave a review. You can follow me on Instagram at IFS Tammy and join our community on Facebook at the One Inside Podcast. Talk to you next time.